How can we begin to enter into generational reconciliation? We're talking about family hurts and father wounds today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager, and today I have an incredible multi-talented guest with a poignant, heart-gripping personal story that he's sharing, and he's been so brave to do that. His name is Michael Charles Olson, and he's a singer and songwriter, a worship leader, and pastor on staff at the Church of the 1122 in Jacksonville, Florida. He's also author of the new book, Daddy Set the Church on Fire. Welcome, Michael. I am so glad to have you on Flourish-Meant today.
Thanks, Tina. It's good to see you. Good to meet you.
Michael, this title, Daddy Set the Church on Fire, immediately touches the heart of somebody who can relate to a story of conflict in their home. Can you talk about how you revealed this personal story and what that was like for you?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned the title, Tina, because it's actually literal. The first part of this book tells an allegorical story, which it actually happened. I grew up in this really, really quirky, eccentric Pentecostal church in the western suburbs of Chicago. My dad was the organist at this church, this brilliant man, brilliant musician. And my dad actually left the organ on, like big church organ on, after a Wednesday night church service, and it shorted out and burnt down the sanctuary that I was raised in. So it's not a figurative title necessarily. It is a literal thing that happened, like an event in history. But what's crazy, Tina, is that plays out as an allegory in what actually happened in our family. My dad was a brilliant man. He was an architect by trade and a brilliant musician. And there's some things that happened in our home that were really painful, and he shorted out. His brilliance, his depth of soul, sort of, the enemy exploited it, and really it took a huge toll on the home that I was raised in. So it's kind of a dual meaning, the title.
So father wounds are not unique to your story, and many people out there may have experienced those in their lives. Can you talk about why this is such a big problem and how it affects us, and what are the steps to start taking once you realize this is a fundamental root that's still going on under the surface in your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important for us to understand that God makes himself known to us as Father. I mean, if you think about it, Tina, he could have picked anything he wanted. He could have picked the sun, or he could have picked a giant oak tree or something like that, but he didn't. He let us know him as primarily as Father. So naturally, the way that we interact with, or the experiences we have with our own Father, shape largely the way that we view who God is and what reality is actually like. So all of us look through this lens, and we live in a broken world. And so even the most perfect home, there's shades of the brokenness of Genesis 3 in the way that we look at our relationship with God through the lens of our earthly fathers. And I spent a lot of time actually with a lot of people who work through that pastorally. And then the second part of that question is, what steps can be taken? Well, one, I think you can't ignore this reality. One, I think you have to acknowledge the wound that you carry. And it could be severe, or it could be more subtle, but chances are it's there. And there's blessings to this too. But I think not acknowledging the wound is not doing you any favors. It's kind of like Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit. The entrance to the kingdom of heaven is dealing with the reality that you're working with. The second, I think you got to acknowledge the reality of Christ and his finished work in that situation. The reality is, for us as believers in Jesus, we really, really do hold to the reality that the cross accomplished so much. And we can apply that to where we're wounded. We really can. And then the third is, I think we just accept, we walk in grace. We realize that we don't have what it takes on our own to solve this problem. We can't, 12 steps to a better version of me through some sort of, self-help healing program is not going to work. But the work of the Spirit of God in restoring you in your identity in Christ, and him becoming your Father and reconciling him to yourself, absolutely potent and powerful.
So in your life and in the lives of many people that you've worked with, did you notice that it was years and years and years of expecting this to just be something they had to deal with and live with, and pushing it down and ignoring it and neglecting it, and not really even acknowledging that they had a father wound or a foundational issue with dysfunction in their family that actually needed to be dealt with. Sometimes we normalize our own experience and we think that's just the way it is. How do you overcome that? How do you begin to recognize if this is a problem in the first place?
Yeah, well, I think the Spirit of God is at work, drawing people into the reality of who God is. And so I think we can either ignore that or we can accept it. The people that I've dealt with the most that have dealt with this are people that would say, "Man, you know what happened? I I went on a journey with the Spirit of God inside my heart. It's a mysterious thing, and it happens through a bunch of different mediums. Could happen through a counselor's office, could happen through a book that you pick up, and ultimately it's the work of the Spirit of God. I think bringing the heart to a place of acknowledgement of where the brokenness is, and it's crazy because it's actually the kindness of God that brings us there. It's actually the kindness of God that brings us to our place of woundedness. And so we have an opportunity, and the people that I know, you can either, when that happens, you can either embrace that knowledge, embrace that sense that the Spirit of God is bringing to you, or you can stiff arm it and say, no, I'm not willing to do this. And I think we all know people that have gone through those processes and gone both ways.
It doesn't feel like kindness when you're facing your distant pain, the pain that you've tried not to look at, does it?
No, but if you went to a doctor, right? Let's say you had some sort of sickness and you didn't know what it was, right, Tina? But you had the symptoms of it. And what would be the most kind thing for that doctor to do to be actually like an ethical doctor? Well, they would tell you the truth about the condition that you had, and then they would diagnose us, and then they would lead you to a solution, right? But they wouldn't be operating in kindness or for your best benefit if they just let it slide. And that's actually what I'm actually talking about is Romans 1. Romans 1 talks about it's God's kindness for him to convict us of our sin. And it's ultimately, where Romans goes is eventually Romans 8, which is some of the best news that we've ever had. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, But in order for us to get there, we have to acknowledge where we're actually at and what we need.
And some of those symptoms can come out relationally later, and you may not realize that it's predicated upon something that happened to you, maybe not something you did as a sin, but it's something that happened to you that's causing you to have conflict in your current relationships. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, one of the themes, especially early on in this book, is childhood, is boyhood. For me, it's the version of childhood that I had the most. And I think those times are intensely valuable. We were made for those seasons of life to exist in the safety of our parents' covering. And again, a lot of the ways that we view God are formed through those periods of time of high trust and being cared for. Sometimes, Tina, those seasons end abruptly and people grow up very, very quickly because of brokenness. That happened in a way for me. The story of my dad burning the sanctuary down is full of meaning. Because when that place of safety in your life is compromised, you begin to develop defense mechanisms, and it impacts the way that you behave relationally and in trust with the world around you. And this is the very kind of brokenness that Jesus came to reconcile. But it often takes a process, it takes a process of trust. You're certainly correct that it plays out in relationships. I spent a lot of time talking to married couples as a pastor about the lens that they look at the world through coming into marriage. And these sort of father issues come out all the time. But the good news for the believer, Tina, is that Christ is at work pulling things together through the finished work of the cross. So that's where our hope is.
How is a solution-focused look at what happened in your life different than simply identifying and blaming someone that hurt you?
Yeah, man, this is a great question. The reason why it's a great question is because I spent years of my life wallowing in a victim mentality and unforgiveness. In fact, what's unique about this story, well, to me it's unique, but the same unforgiveness that caused my dad's life to sort of shrink down and created my father wound. There's some really painful things that happened in my home that my dad reacted to, and it was unforgiveness. That same thing happened in my life in a different later season, and the same thing happened to me. My life was shrunk down, but here's what happened to me. As the story goes, I had a couple adventures. One was in Israel. I found myself on the shores of the Sea of Galilee where Jesus reinstated Peter. And at that place, Peter really grappled with his brokenness, his mistakes, his sin. He denied Jesus 3 times. And 3 times he was invited to follow. Would you feed my sheep? Would you feed my sheep? And there's certain things that Peter had to give up in brokenness in his past in order to embrace the new life that Jesus was calling him into. The same thing happened to me. I finally figured out that the adventure of following Jesus on the path of forgiveness, of forgiving people in my life, was more appealing and more adventurous than holding on to my own hurt. When I found that out through the book of 1 John, actually, it changed everything about everything in my life.
Such rich wisdom and such a deeply moving, authentic experience that you're sharing in this book. How can people get a copy of your book and stay connected with you?
Yeah, I'm so happy to say that michaelcharlesolson.com is up and rocking and running. And there's information on the book and the music. There also daddysetthechurchonfire.com. It's kind of easy to remember because it's such a hooky title. So I would invite people to go. There's actually a ton of information. Both those sites are really, really well done, and they're up and functional.
I hope that all of you listening, if you or those you love have experienced generational wounds, family wounds in your life, have found a place where you can seek healing and restoration and freedom so that you can expand your spiritual, abundant life to what it is meant to be. And of course, I also hope that you will come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant.